Hey guys, so today we're going to start the first of our biogeochemical cycles. A biogeochemical cycle describes the way that a nutrient or a molecule or a compound is cycled through an ecosystem. And today we're going to be looking at the carbon cycle. So when we're looking at the carbon cycle, what you're going to be talking about is how carbon moves through the atmosphere, lithosphere, and hydrosphere. You do need to know the correct terminology for each of these processes, and you have to be able to identify the processes that we're talking about. So for each of these cycles, including this carbon cycle, if you were given a diagram representing the cycle, you would have to be able to identify each of the processes on that diagram, but you also have to be able to identify the processes if you're just given a description of what's happening as well, okay? Then we're briefly going to look at some of the human impacts of the carbon cycle and then the relationship between the carbon cycle and climate change. So the carbon cycle is a biogeochemical cycle where carbon atoms are exchanged between the lithosphere, which as a reminder is the ground, the hydrosphere, which is the water, and then the atmosphere that surrounds us. It describes how carbon is recycled and reused in the biosphere. And this cycle, along with the other biogeochemical cycles like the nitrogen cycle and the water cycle, are required for life to be sustained on Earth. If this cycle or any of the biogeochemical cycles that we're going to look at shut down all of a sudden, life on Earth would come to an end. So carbon is the main compound in biological organisms. You may have heard the term carbon-based life forms before, which describes all of the living things here on Earth. Carbon is also found in many minerals, and it exists in more than one form in the atmosphere. There are three main reservoirs of inorganic carbon. By a reservoir, we mean a place that carbon is stored, and by inorganic, we mean non-living. So the three main reservoirs of inorganic carbon are the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, mostly the oceans, and the lithosphere. And then organic carbon is stored in living things. Anytime living things die and decay, that organic carbon is going to be broken down into inorganic carbon, which will return to one of the inorganic carbon reservoirs. So carbon in the atmosphere is found in two main forms: carbon dioxide, which is CO2, and methane, which is CH4. Now, those aren't the only two forms of carbon in the atmosphere, but they are by far the most common two. Both of them are also greenhouse gases, meaning that they absorb and retain heat that would otherwise go out into the atmosphere and then into space. Carbon dioxide can leave the atmosphere during photosynthesis in plants, so it can be brought into the plants and then used to make glucose. And carbon dioxide does also dissolve in water. Most of Earth's carbon is stored in the lithosphere, so carbon in the lithosphere can be released into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. That happens anytime carbonate rocks are subducted into the mantle. So that's like when you have like two tectonic plates and one slips below the other, that is subduction. And when that happens, the plate that's slipping below essentially melts and turns into mantle. That carbon dioxide that's in the mantle can then be released during a volcanic eruption. Carbon is also stored in the lithosphere and then in the form of like fossil fuels, and then carbon dioxide can be released when those fossil fuels are burnt. Also, anytime carbonate rocks are just like eroded or worn away, that can also release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And then carbon in the hydrosphere, the ocean is the largest inorganic carbon reservoir by far. Atmospheric carbon dioxide can be dissolved in water and then converted into carbonate. Organic carbon can also dissolve in the water. That dissolved organic carbon can then leave the hydrosphere by diffusing back into the atmosphere. or it can be used by autotrophs and then enter the food chain. And some aquatic organisms also use dissolved carbonate to build their shells. And when those organisms die and their shells break down, it would be released back into the hydrosphere. All living things, both dead and alive. So when we say living things, we mean anything that is or was living. All of those are carbon-based organisms, so they're made out of organic carbon compounds. Autotrophs obviously take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it into organic carbon, in this case stored glucose, via photosynthesis. Photosynthesis involves a process called carbon fixation, which is just atmospheric carbon being converted into organic carbon. And then heterotrophs can gain that organic carbon by consuming other organisms. And anytime an animal dies or a plant dies and starts to decay, it will release that carbon back into the soil and the atmosphere. And animal waste also releases carbon into both the soil and the atmosphere. Or if we're talking about aquatic plants and animals, it will go into the hydrosphere instead. And then all living organisms also release carbon dioxide into the air during cellular respiration. This is much more of a factor with animals than plants. Okay, so this is an example of a diagram that would represent the carbon cycle. Now, on a test or quiz, don't expect to see this exact diagram, but you could have a diagram of the carbon cycle or a part of the carbon cycle. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through what these different processes are. But this slide right here that is blank, it doesn't have any of the processes labeled, is a really good tool to use when studying. So let's just go to the next slide here. So this is what all of these processes actually are. So let's go through them one at a time. So this is the atmosphere up here where this cloud is. So we have both carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere. If we go down to the lithosphere, which is this soil part down here, we have carbon that is stored in rocks. We have carbon that's stored in soil. And we also have, represented by this little dinosaur head here, our fossil fuels. And then over on the far right here, we have the hydrosphere, which contains dissolved carbon dioxide, carbonate, and organic compounds. So one of the ways that carbon moves from the lithosphere down here, where the carbon is stored in rocks, into the atmosphere are these processes of subduction and volcanic activity. So carbon that's stored in the rocks is subducted into the mantle where it dissolves, and then that dissolved carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere during a volcanic eruption. So anytime you see something going into and out of a volcano, that is subduction going into the volcano, a volcanic eruption or volcanic activity that is bringing that carbon dioxide into the air. If we're talking about, actually let's finish off with the carbon stored in the rocks. Carbon that is stored in the rocks can also be directly released into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide through the process of erosion, which I don't actually have labels here for some reason, but that arrow right there is erosion. Then if we talk about plants, obviously plants can take that carbon dioxide out of the air in the form of photosynthesis. The opposite process of photosynthesis, which takes carbon dioxide out of the air into a living thing, is cellular respiration, where living things release carbon dioxide anytime they breathe out. You also might see this little arrow right here. Anytime you have arrows going between living things, that is something called assimilation, and we'll talk about that more when we get into the next biogeochemical cycles. You also have flatulence, which is one of the ways that methane is released into the air. Essentially, that is like gases or farting being released from different animals. Usually ungulates are really bad for this. So when you hooved animals like cows, though certainly there are aquatic organisms, tiny aquatic organisms, that are really bad for their release of methane as well. Then anytime you have a dead organism, like this dead cow here, it's going to release gases directly into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. It will also decay and release carbon into the soil. Animal waste will also break down and release carbon into the soil. Then if we go over to our fossil fuels here, extraction is the process of pulling fossil fuels out of the ground in order to be used by humans. And then the actual burning of those fossil fuels is what releases a lot of carbon dioxide. So combustion is the term that we use for the burning of fossil fuels. And then lastly, if we look over at our hydrosphere here, we have something called a gas exchange happening, which is just the process of carbon dioxide diffusing out of the water into the atmosphere, and then atmospheric carbon dioxide dissolving back into the water. Okay, so make sure you know essentially this slide. Any process on here you do have to be familiar with, as well as erosion, which isn't labeled, but is when carbon stored in rocks are broken down and release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Oh, there it is. I just didn't click one far enough. Okay, so that process there is erosion. So again, use this slide here in order to kind of get familiar with this, practice studying it, but do expect for any of these biogeochemical cycles that if you see a diagram on a test or quiz, it's probably not going to be this exact diagram. So you just want to make sure that you can kind of recognize these different processes, even if it doesn't look exactly like this. Again, also need to know descriptions of these processes. So if I just say, you know, the burning of gas in your car, you have to know that I'm referring to combustion, for example. Okay, let me know if you have any more questions about this.